I'm installing a curved turnout in existing track on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroading tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure and subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you won't miss a thing. No matter how much work we do on a track plan and planning out a layout before we start, inevitably we come to a point in the building of a layout where we realize that there's something we'd like to do differently. Changes are always a part of model railroad layout building. All of us make them from time to time. Some of them are major and drastic, and some of them are just minor tweaks along the way to help the railroad look better and operate better. Well, today I'm going to make one of those minor tweaks to my layout. In order to facilitate better operation, I'm going to be adding a curved turnout into an existing curve. Now that can be a real challenge, but I'm going to show you how to do it and how to make it work today. Have you gone back and made any changes to the track work or track plan on your layout? If so, let me know about it in the comment section down below. Now let's go over to this part of my layout and I'll show you the project we're going to be doing today. This is the section of my layout that I'm working with today. And when I originally planned and laid out this track, I had this long sweeping S-curve because that's what I needed to put in this location in order to maintain my minimum radius and still be able to get from the short peninsula, which is down on this end, all the way around and back to be lined to go through the wall, which is just behind the camera, into the area where my staging yard is. So this S-curve was necessary, but in this area I of course wanted to have my downtown yard, which is an interchange between BNSF and the Union Pacific, and I also am planning to run some Amtrak trains on this layout, and so I wanted to model Fort Worth's passenger station. So I installed these two turnouts right here. This one obviously feeds into downtown yard, and my plan was for this turnout to feed into a spur that would just serve the passenger station. I ran into several problems with that plan once I had laid this track. The first problem was the fact that this spur was not long enough for my passenger train. Even though I'm running a fairly short passenger train, it wasn't long enough to hold the whole train. So that obviously was a major problem. The second problem was, in order to make that train even come close to fitting in there, in order to maximize that length, I was going to have to curve this track, and I didn't want a curved track running through my passenger platform. So that wasn't really going to work either. Dealing with the problem with the length of my track made me decide finally to go a completely different route anyway. And what I've decided to do is to install a curved turnout back in this area, right in here, on this curve. And then I will take my passenger spur off of that curved turnout back over this direction. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to model just the passenger platform on this side of the track, and I actually won't model the station at all. It would be set off of the layout up here to the front. And then this turnout that I have in place, I'm going to go ahead and put this spur in here, and I've decided to model another industry in this area right here. So this is what we're working on today. We're going to take this existing curve and we're going to install this curved turnout in this existing curve. That can be a little bit of a challenge, but I'm going to show you how we do that today. And I think that if we are very careful, this is going to come out working really, really well. The first step in this process is to figure out exactly where I want my curved turnout to be. Now I've played with this quite a bit, trying to get the curved turnout in just the right position. Now, I was fortunate in that my curve radius in this area is 18 inches, and I found a Pico curved turnout, which is what I'm working with today, that has an inside or diverging route radius of 18, which is exactly matches my curve, and the outside curve radius is 36 inches. So this will work well for this area. A couple things that I want to do here. First of all, I want to get this set to where my diverging route is coming off at just the angle that I want. So I've got my spur track just kind of laid out here kind of to get a sense of that. And I think right in there is going to be a good location. Secondly, I want to line this up so that the ties, as much as possible, line up with the ties on the existing track. That way, whenever I install this, my tie spacing should come out pretty good on each end. So I'll get that in place, and then I'm just going to hold it down with a piece of wide painter's tape, just to kind of hold it in that place that I want it. Again, this is just temporary while I get it marked and set. Now I've got my ties lined up, and one thing that I'll have to do here is when I'm done with this, I'll have to add some feeder wires. I have a set of feeder wires on this piece of track on this side, but on this side, my next set of feeders are all the way on the other side of the wall, which is, a good 3 or 4 feet away. And since I'm cutting the track here, I don't want to have to really depend on the conductivity of the electricity through the turnout. Even though these are power routing turnouts, I don't want to depend on the turnout to power this section of track. So I'll be adding some feeder wires on the other end of this track here. Okay, I've got my turnout lined up. My rails are lined up very well on each end. My ties are lined up. Now I'm going to take a Sharpie, and I always keep some of these Sharpies around that have the dual points, has a regular point on one end, but it has the fine point on the other, because for marking things like this, these are really, really handy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this rail. I'm going to mark it right at the end of the rail from the turnout. Not marking it under the turnout. I'm marking it so that basically that side of the mark will be right along the edge of the end of the rail for the turnout itself. And I'm going to do that on both ends here. And this is going to show me exactly where to cut this rail. And with that's got those marked really well. And with those marks in place, I can take this tape back off. That just helped me hold it in place. And there you can see my marks right there and right there. And we are ready to cut this rail. One of the things you got to be very careful about when you make a mark is to know exactly where on that mark to cut. If you remember, I made these marks so that they were right at the end of the rail on my curved turnout. So I want to actually cut on the inside of this mark. I want to leave the mark on the existing rail here. Same way down here on the other end. I want to leave the mark on the rail. I want to cut just this side of the rail. And to cut these, I'm going to use my Dremel tool with a cutoff disc in it. And we're going to try to cut those just as square as I possibly can. It's going to angle just a little bit, so I'm going to try to leave room for that, and we will file that down and make it square. So right now we're just going to make the cuts. One thing you want to make sure you do when you're cutting this, if you're using flex track, as I am, is you want to make sure you cut all the way through the ties where they tie together. Cut through that plastic so that it will come up easily as well. Now I've got a thin putty knife. I like to use as thin a putty knife as I can. And I'm going to come in here and try to very carefully just slip underneath this section of track. And this is glued down with latex caulk, so should come up easily, and as you see it did. Now I'm going to come in with a needle file, a flat needle file, and I'm just going to clean up these rail joints a little bit. I'm also going to begin test fitting my my curved turnout in here. The first thing I want to do is make sure that I don't have any flash left in the webs of the rails, and I want to make sure the top of the head of the rail is really smooth. I don't want to have something that's going to cause running problems as my trains run through there. So I'm going to make sure those are good. And then I'm going to make sure that they are filed down really good and square also. And then we're also going to work a little bit on the bottoms here, which is going to be a little more of a challenge because I've got that plastic from the ties underneath that, but we can come in here if we get it at the right angle and just touch those up a little bit. I'm also going to put just a little bit of an angle, just take the corner off of the base of the rail there. That will make it easier for my rail joiners to go on. Now I've got my rails filed down. One thing I didn't mention earlier that you want to be aware of here, when you're working in a section like this where I'm working in an existing curve, when I cut this rail, as you can see, this rail kind of straightened out and popped out a little bit right here at the end. They did that on both sides. That's natural. That's going to happen. We're going to work to alleviate that later. But one of the things you need to be aware of is when you pull this back in, you're actually shortening that distance of the rail through the turnout. So you need to make sure that you cut your turnout with just a little bit of extra space in order to allow for that difference. And so that's what I did. I filed that back just a little bit extra so that I can make sure that it fits in and allows for those rails to come back into place. Now, if I was laying new rail, I would come in here and cut one tie off of each end here. But since I'm not laying new rail, that's going to be very difficult to do. It's hard to cut underneath these rails. Plus, in my situation, where I'm dropping a turnout down into a section between two existing pieces of track, I somehow have to get the rail joiners onto the track. So the rail joiners are going to have to slide all the way onto either the rail on the main line that's here or the rails on the turnout. And I can't really cut very easily and remove those ties entirely. So what I'm going to do, and if you look here, I need to alleviate the problem through about 2 ties. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a chisel-shaped blade. Normally I would use a number 17 blade in my X-Acto knife, but I'm out of number 17 blades. But I happen to have this number 18. It fits a knife handle that I don't even have a handle that size, so I'm just using it by hand. But it's a chisel type blade, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come in on those 2 ties, and I'm going to carefully just remove the tie plate and spike detail and scrape just a little bit underneath the rail on both sides of the rail on every one of these. See, I'm just going to remove that spike head and that detail and scrape just a little bit of plastic out from under there. And what that's going to do, and I can already hear some people hollering, as I know they will, but what that's going to do is that's going to give just enough room for my rail joiner to slide underneath the rail and on top of those ties, and then allow me to slide that all the way on, and then I can put my turnout in place and then slide it back up onto my turnout. I'm going to try. Now this is always a challenge. I have been through this before, and I'm not going to claim that this is the easiest part of this by any means, but the challenge is to slip that rail joiner on the rail, so my fingers aren't too much in the way, underneath the rail, but on top of the ties that are there. There, that one slid right on, and I'm just going to push it all the way up onto the rail. There goes that one. Go. Finally, there we go. Okay, now that I got the rail joiners onto the existing rails, I have to repair the turnout to go into place. And I could come and remove a tie off of each end of the turnout, but I really don't like to do that on turnouts. I really prefer to do what I did here, and that is I'm going to remove that spike detail just on the very last tie of each end. Before I do that, I want to take a moment to use my NMRA gauge and check the gauge of the rails on this turnout as it goes. Pico turnouts, at least the medium radius Exzel frog turnouts that I use the most, are notorious for being a little bit tight in gauge at the ends on the frog end of the turnout. Now these are perfect, and of course I've gone through and checked all the flange ways and everything too. And if you don't know how to use one of these NMRA gauges to check, you need to make sure you check all of those specs on a turnout, and I'll show you how to do that in another video. But now we're ready to go and install our turnout into place. Now, I know when you get into laying track, there's a lot of discussion and debate among model railroaders. Should you solder your turnouts into place? Should you not solder them into place? Should you glue them down? Should you not glue them down? And I don't want to get into that whole debate, but I'm just going to tell you what I do. I do solder my turnouts into place, and we'll be doing that in just a few moments. And I also do glue my turnouts down, but I don't glue the entire turnout down. First of all, obviously you want to stay away from any kind of adhesive right in the area of the points and the switch rod and those moving parts. Don't need any glue there for sure, because you'll cause some real problems. I just want to help hold the turnout into place. Of course, the existing track will help hold it in place because it's glued down on both ends. So what I do is I literally just use a small amount of adhesive right underneath the area of the frog. And so I'm just going to lay the turnout into place so we can see the frog area is right here. And so I'm going to put just a little bit of adhesive right in here. Now, I use a latex caulk for this. What I'm using today is actually DAP. I don't know if you can see that. Yes, Alex Plus, upside down, sorry. But this is an acrylic latex caulk that has adhesive properties that works great for this. And I just want to put a small dab of caulk right in the middle of the road bed there, right where the center of the rails will be. And of course, obviously that's too thick. That'll squeeze right up through the rails. So I'm going to take a putty knife and I'm just going to knock that down so where it's nice and thin across there. I want it to come up between the rails just enough to hold it in place, but not enough to squeeze up to where it'll go through and show through up into the ballast. And I always use a medium gray caulk for this because I usually am using a gray ballast, but whatever color ballast I use, it will normally cover all of that up, but if any of it shows through, a gray won't look too out of the ordinary. And so now at this point, I'm ready to come in and install my turnout. So I'm going to come first of all on this end. I'm just going to try to line those rails up and carefully, I'm going to take my needle nose pliers and slide that rail joiner that is up on the mainline rail and try to slide it right onto the rail of my turnout. And there, that's just working right up onto the rail on my turnout. And then we'll work this one up, hopefully. And there we go. And those are pretty well centered. Now I come up here. There it goes. Okay. Now I've got my rail joiners onto the rails. And this is where I realized that in my effort to make sure my turnout would fit, I actually cut my rails a little short. And I do have some gaps. But I'm going to be able to fix that. And I'll show you how at the end of this video. Now I want to make sure that this is pressed down into that caulk, and this tie right here, where I've had so much trouble with this one turnout, this tie is just pretty much destroyed, and so I'm going to try to pull it out here. It's only connected on one side. It's one of the expansion ties or flex ties, and so there, I'm just going to pull that out. We'll come back and put a replacement tie in there whenever we are finished. Now I'm preparing to do my soldering. Whenever I'm soldering rail, whether it's soldering rail together or soldering on feeders, I always solder on the outside of the rail. I never solder on the inside of the rail. I know some people who do solder on the inside of the rail because they always want to do the back of the rail where it won't show. There's just way too much opportunity for solder to get in the way and interfere with your wheels and with your flanges if you're soldering on the inside, especially with little in-scale track. So I always solder on the outside. I've already put some flux on these joints, and literally I just have an old micro brush here. I'm using a paste type flux. You can also use a liquid flux. I've used both. Either one works fine. But I just put a little bit of flux along the outside of the rail where the rail joiner is, making sure I get some flux on both pieces of rail and the joiner. And I've done that on the outside on all 4 of these joints. Now, I've already done that, so you don't need to watch me do that. Then, whenever I go to solder rail, again, I didn't remove ties here, so I don't want to stay on that rail any longer than I have to. But I want to stay on it long enough to get a good joint. So what I do is I take my good clean tip and I put some solder on the tip itself. That is the fastest way to get the solder onto the rail. You can see that drip of solder right there ready. And then when I'm working in a situation like this where I'm working in a curve with existing track, I want to make sure that my rails don't kink at the joints. And so I come in with, this is just an old micro screwdriver, and this one's kind of beat up, so I use it for this purpose. And I put it on the inside of the rail and just pry out slightly, and I look down the rail to make sure the curve looks really good. Try to stay out of the way of the camera here. Pry on it just slightly, like that. And then I come in and I touch this to the rail just long enough for that you see the solder to burn as it smokes and the solder flows, and we've got a good joint there. It's nice and shiny, which is a good sign. The solder flows under the joint and in the middle of the joint to the bottom of the inside of the rail, so you get solder on the inside. But you don't put a lot of solder on the inside because you did it from the outside. And I'm holding the screwdriver in place until that cools, so it's nice and hard. Now it should have had plenty of time there, and we've got a nice clean rail joint right there. I want to be careful when I'm working in this section here on the diverging route on the frog end, so I don't want to get solder on this rail that I'm not soldering yet. I don't even know if you can see that. There, that's good. I don't want to get solder on the diverging rail over here whenever I'm trying to solder this rail. And then I'm going to touch that to that, let the solder flow. I don't allow rail joiners to be my electrical conductive system because rail joiners are notoriously bad about conducting electricity. But if you solder the joints, the solder is a good conductor of electricity, so it will actually help the electricity flow through those rail joints. I still don't depend on them. I still put feeders very often on my track just to make sure that I have good electrical contact. But and there we have it. Now those are all soldered together. Now I'm going to carefully come back and I want to clean up any excess solder. I get just a little bit of solder in places on the rail heads. I don't want to do too much filing on these rail heads if I can keep from it, but just enough to remove any excess solder that we have, and just to clean that up. And then I always like to feel the inside, but I always also like to just run the file along the inside of the rail heads just to make sure there's no solder there or anything that's going to interfere. Tops of the heads, file a little bit on the inside, so I think, yeah, we're in really good shape right there. The fact that this is all soldered together would hold that down in that caulk fine anyway, but just to make sure, I'm going to take a push pin and come in here right between the rails where these closure rails come together. And I'm just going to push a push pin down in that to help hold it in place and hold it down while that caulk cures. In each of these joints where I just soldered these together, there's a little bit of flux there, a little residue of that flux. And I want to clean that flux up, because if you don't, it will interfere with the paint whenever you go to paint your track, and it just becomes a sticky mess over time. So I'm literally just going to take a toothbrush and some denatured alcohol and clean those up a little bit. Now that we've got everything in place and pretty well cleaned up, we'll go back to this little section where I had to remove a tie. And here I have a tie that I took off of a scrap rail. And I've taken the spike head detail off and sanded the bottom of it just a little bit to thin it down just a little. And I'm just going to slide it into place where that rail, or where that tie was that we messed up. I'm going to get it kind of centered where I want it. And then I'm going to hold it in place. I could glue that with just about anything, but in this case I'm going to come in with just a little bit of CA and come in here between the rails. I don't want to get it on the ties, but I want to just put a drop between the ties right there, and that will run down in there and hold that tie in place, and we are looking like we are in pretty good shape. I want to come back now to this area where I had these two gaps. This is obviously a situation that you want to avoid if you can, but unfortunately sometimes it happens. There is something you can do about that, fortunately. And what I'm going to do, and this is what I've done many times before, and that is I'm going to come in with, just got some scraps of styrene out of my scrap box, and I test fit them, and this one fits in this gap, and this thinner one fits pretty well in this gap. And I'm just going to come and I'm going to glue these in there, and I'm going to use some super glue to do that, some CA here. I'm just going to put a drop of CA right on the styrene itself, and I don't want to get too carried away there. And I'm going to set that down into the gap right where the CA is. Get it down in there good and tight. And then I'm going to do the same with this one on the other side. Drop on there. And then I'm going to set that over here in the gap. And hopefully I can get it to set up for a minute. And with those in place, and then I'm going to come in with some accelerator and an applicator brush and just put a drop of accelerator in there just to get that to set up quickly. And I'll do that on both sides just to make sure that CA is quickly cured. Now I'm going to come in with some side cutters and just cut away the excess. And same here, right up next to the rail. I'm going to just cut that. There we go. Cut that away each way, and then I'm going to come right here on top of the rail. Cut it off right there. Same with this one. Now with those little pieces of styrene glued into place, and I've allowed time for that glue to cure, I'm going to come in with a file, and I'm just going to file that styrene down to the size and shape of the rail. Now this will take a little bit of time, but that styrene's fairly soft, so it shouldn't take a lot of time. You do want to make sure that your CA has completely cured before you do this. Otherwise, your little piece of styrene will just come popping out of the rail. But as long as your CA has cured, you should be able to file this without any problem. Now I want to be careful, because I want to file it down to the level of the rail, but I don't want to do a lot of filing on the rail itself and cause some problems. So I'm just going to take a little time. Don't want to be in a big hurry here because I don't want to file something in a way I don't want to, but just going to file this down to match the shape of the rail. You want to get this file down and shaped to the point where your standards gauge will run through it smoothly. I'm almost there, but I'm catching just a little bit, so I'm going to keep filing a little bit on the inside of these. And there we go. That's running pretty smoothly through there. I think we're in pretty good shape and gauge there. And now, looking at that on camera, yes, you can see where that white plastic is. But once you come back and paint these rails, you will hardly ever even know that that was there. Probably won't be able to see it at all. And now we can test it with a piece of rolling stock. And as you see, I can push it through the turnout, and it's rolling smoothly through both sets of rail joiners, through both joints. It's rolling smoothly through the points, and looks like we're in pretty good shape. Points are moving back and forth smoothly. This diverging rail here for the lead into the passenger station will be insulated. We're going to come back and work with that later. I'm going to have to work some more with the roadbed area before I'm ready to lay that. So we'll do that at a different time. That'll be a subject for another video. But this is come together pretty well, and it definitely has made it possible for me to get my passenger station spur in here in a way that's going to work a lot better than what I had originally planned. So that's a way that you can install a curved turnout into an existing curve, an existing track, and make it work out pretty well with just a little bit of time and attention to detail. And this is a project that, if you need to, you can do yourself. Despite my little problem with the gaps in the rails that I had to fill, this turnout fit into this curve perfectly, and I think it's going to really add to the operation of my layout. It's going to enable me to run my passenger trains much more efficiently in and out of the passenger station in Fort Worth. And as you just saw, locomotives and rolling stock seem to be rolling through it freely and without a problem. Sometimes we all need to make some changes to our layout, and that can be a frightening thing. But I hope this project today has encouraged you to know that just because you need to make a little change to the track work on your layout doesn't mean you're going to ruin your track work. In fact, it may provide exactly what you need for that type of operation that you've been hoping for. So don't be afraid to give it a try. If you enjoyed this video, here's a link to some more videos that I know you'll enjoy as well. If you did enjoy it, give it a thumbs up down below. Be sure and share it wherever model railroaders hang out. And of course, you'll want to subscribe down below so you can catch future episodes. I also hope you'll check out the description down below this video. There you'll see a link to my Amazon page and my pick of the week. Some great products there related to model railroading, to video making, and much more. But even if you do just your regular Amazon shopping through those links, you'll enjoy that same Amazon service and prices that you're used to, and you'll help to support this channel at the same time. Also in the description, you'll find a link to my Patreon page, where you'll see the rewards for those who invest in Ron's Trains and Things on an ongoing basis. I hope you'll check that out as well. Well, be sure and join me again next Tuesday as I'll be bringing you another great model railroading video, and I look forward to seeing you then. Lizzie?